The fire in the hearth crackled against the stone wall, its glow spilling across the wooden beams of the small cabin. Outside, the late autumn wind whistled through the gaps of the village, carrying with it the lonely cry of an owl. It was the late 1800s, and in this corner of the American frontier, life was still shaped by the rhythm of survival. Hunting, gathering, and enduring the long winters. Yet, on this night, survival meant something far different. She stood in the middle of the cabin, her breath unsteady, her fingers trembling as she clutched the fabric at her chest. The weight of her choice pressed down on her, heavier than the silence that filled the room. Before her stood the man she had never thought she would seek out for help, a muscular Apache warrior. His skin bronzed by sun, his long black hair cascading over his shoulders, adorned with tribal jewelry that glinted in the firelight. His chest was bare, showing the marks of strength and small tribal tattoos etched into his skin like stories written by his ancestors. He looked at her with eyes sharp as flint, unreadable, waiting. She had heard stories of him whispered in the village, stories that painted him as both protector and danger. To some, he was a shadow that moved through the forest unseen, a hunter who knew every path, every sound, every shift of the wind. To others, he was a threat, the embodiment of the clash between the old ways and the settlers pushing into lands that were not their own. But to her, at this moment, he was her last chance. Her heart pounded as she lowered her eyes, unable to meet his piercing stare. She had come here desperate, driven by something she could not carry alone. Fear, perhaps, or maybe it was a burden too heavy for her family, her neighbors, her village to understand. She took it off slowly, her hands shaking, the cloth slipping through her fingers like water. And when she did, the truth of her plea was laid bare in the warm glow of the firelight. The warrior did not move. His breath was steady, his arms strong and still at his sides, but his silence cut deeper than words ever could. She searched his face, waiting for judgment, for anger, for the rejection she feared most. Instead, she found nothing. Only that steady, unbroken gaze that made her chest ache. Outside, the sound of horses echoed faintly from the edge of the woods. Riders were near, their shadows long against the pale moonlight. The village would not sleep peacefully tonight. Too many whispers of raids, too many warnings had gone unanswered. And now, danger pressed close, closer than anyone wanted to admit. She had not meant for this to happen, but once she saw them ride in, cloaked in dust and carrying weapons, she knew there was no time left. Her people would not believe her. They would not listen. They thought the Apache was their enemy, not their salvation. Yet here she was, standing in front of him, hoping against reason that he would hear her plea. The fire snapped, sending sparks upward. The warrior finally stepped closer, the light shifting across the lines of his face. His presence filled the space, powerful and steady. Yet there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if he too carried his own burdens, his own scars hidden beneath the strength he wore so openly. Her voice broke the silence, fragile but firm. "I need your help. They're coming. If you don't stand with us, everything will be lost." Her words trembled in the air, carrying more weight than she intended. It wasn't just the village she feared losing. It was the fragile thread of hope she had clung to for so long. Hope that there was a way to bridge the divide, to see beyond the hatred and suspicion that had built walls between their worlds. For a moment, she thought he would turn away. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickered toward the fire, then back to her. He was not a man easily swayed by pleas. His people had suffered too, driven from their lands, betrayed by promises, watched as their traditions were pushed aside. Helping her village meant risking everything he still had left. But then his hand rose, slowly, deliberately, and rested over the necklace he wore. The beads and feathers whispered of his lineage, of the weight of choices passed down from fathers to sons. His next move was not one of impulse but of decision, shaped by something deeper than words. The tension thickened in the room. She could barely breathe as she waited, her hands pressed against her chest as though to steady her heart. She had come here believing she might leave with nothing, yet in the firelit stillness she sensed a shift. Something was happening, something that could not be undone once it began. The sound of hooves grew louder outside. The riders were close now. Soon they would reach the village, and everything would be set in motion. She glanced toward the door, then back at him, fear tightening her chest. Would he stand with her, or would he let her walk out into the night alone? The warrior's eyes narrowed, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came yet. Instead, he stepped nearer, so close the warmth of his skin met hers, so close she could hear the steady rhythm of his breath. He studied her, searching her face as if measuring the truth of her desperation. Her pulse raced. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. His hand shifted, brushing lightly against the edge of what she had revealed to him, not with desire, but with the weight of understanding. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, as if he had seen not just her plea, but the fear and strength hidden beneath it. The fire roared louder, the shadows dancing wildly against the cabin walls. In that moment, she knew her life was no longer her own. Whatever he chose next, it would change everything. For her, for him, for the village that slept, unaware of the storm about to break over them. And then, just as the riders' voices rose outside, echoing through the night, he moved. But what he chose, whether to walk away or to fight alongside her, remained locked in the silence between them, suspended in that breathless moment that held the power to shape both their fates forever. The warrior stood so close now that the firelight traced every line of his face, and though he had yet to speak, his presence alone carried an answer she could not yet read. The weight of the moment pressed on both of them, the sound of horses outside reminding her that time was slipping away. She dared not break the silence, afraid that even one misplaced word could change the course of everything. His eyes shifted, not to her hands or the fire, but to the door as if he was listening to something beyond what she could hear. His stillness was not hesitation. It was calculation. The sound of voices drifted through the cracks of the cabin, faint but clear. The riders outside were closer than she had thought, their tones carrying the harshness of men hardened by the trail. She couldn't make out every word, but she knew enough. They were searching, their movements deliberate, as though they already suspected that the village ahead held something worth taking. Fear rose in her throat, but the warrior did not flinch. His eyes closed for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, the fire reflected in his gaze gave him an almost unearthly strength. For the first time since she entered, she wondered what he truly thought of her being there. To her people, he was a reminder of a past they would rather forget, a symbol of resistance that unsettled the fragile peace they claimed to hold. Yet she knew what they didn't. She had seen enough to understand that survival in these lands required more than suspicion and fear. She needed him, even if asking meant betraying the very boundaries her village had drawn. And now, standing in his presence, she realized just how much he carried, how much history lived in his silence. Her mind wandered back to the stories told around the hearth in her own home. They spoke of raids, of fires set under the dark of night, of families divided by bloodshed. Every tale had been painted with one color, one perspective, that the Apache were the enemy, fierce and merciless. But as she looked at him now, nothing about his face or his stillness spoke of cruelty. Instead, she saw depth, restraint, and the kind of strength that came not from destruction, but from survival. The warrior finally shifted, moving toward the window, his steps as quiet as a shadow. He peered through the cracks in the wood, his jaw tightening. She watched him closely, waiting for some sign, some word that would tell her if she had made a mistake coming here. His silence was unbearable, but there was also something strangely comforting about it. He was not a man who wasted words, and that alone told her he measured everything with great care. "Why me?" His voice came at last, low and steady, like the ground rumbling beneath distant thunder. The question struck her harder than she expected. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she could not answer. She had asked herself the same thing when she first thought of seeking him out. Why him? Why turn to the one man her people feared more than the threat that now approached? But the answer came easily, even if her voice trembled as she spoke it. "Because you know what they don't," she whispered. "Because you've seen what's coming, and you're not afraid to face it." His gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as though he was testing the truth of her words. Then he turned back to the window, his shoulders rigid, his breath slow and steady. She could sense the conflict within him. Helping her meant stepping into a battle not only against the men outside but against the walls her people had built between them. He was not blind to the danger of that choice. The riders moved past the cabin, their voices fading into the distance. But she knew they would circle back. This was only the beginning. Her pulse slowed just enough for her to breathe, though every inhale felt heavy. She wanted to reach for him, to beg again, but something held her back. She could see in his eyes that he had already heard more than her words could say. The cabin's walls seemed to close in on her as the silence stretched. The flickering fire cast shadows that danced across his figure, reminding her of the countless nights she had imagined warriors like him hidden in the trees, watching over the valley. She wondered what his people thought of hers, If they whispered stories of settlers with the same fear and bitterness that her village spoke of them, perhaps they had every reason to. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, to the first time she had seen him from afar. He had been on horseback, his long hair catching the wind, his posture tall and proud against the horizon. She remembered how the villagers had hurried her inside, warning her never to stare, never to speak of him. But even then she hadn't seen an enemy. She had seen a figure who seemed larger than life, bound to the land in a way she could not explain. Now, standing only a breath away from him, that feeling returned, stronger than ever. The warrior finally turned back from the window, his expression unreadable. His hand brushed against the necklace at his chest, the beads and feathers shifting softly. It was as though he was grounding himself in something older than both of them, something that carried the weight of choice. "You're asking me to fight for people who would never fight for me," he said quietly. Each word sharp but not cruel. Her heart clenched at the truth in his words. She could not deny it. She had seen how her people treated those like him, with distrust, with distance, with unspoken disdain. Asking him to risk everything for them was more than desperate. It was unfair. And yet she had no other choice. "They may never see you for who you are," she said, her voice breaking. "But I do. And I know without you, we don't stand a chance." The air thickened between them once more, the fire popping as though to mark the weight of her confession. He studied her in silence, and she wondered if her words had reached him, or if he had already decided against her before she ever stepped foot into the cabin. A howl echoed through the woods, long and mournful, carried by the wind. Both of them stilled, listening. It was not just the call of a wolf, it was a signal, a warning. Something was moving in the dark beyond the village, and they both knew it. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her gaze toward the door, her heart pounding all over again. The riders were not alone. The night itself seemed to pulse with an energy she could not explain, as if the earth beneath them already knew what was about to unfold. The warrior stepped closer, his shadow merging with hers in the firelight. His presence was steady, grounding, but his silence was unbearable. She wanted him to say yes, to promise her that he would stand by her side. But instead he simply looked at her, his eyes deep with something she could not yet name, something that held both warning and possibility. The wind rattled the wooden beams above, the cabin creaking in protest. Her hands tightened at her sides, her chest heavy with the weight of what was to come. She knew the night would not end quietly. The danger that lingered outside was only the beginning, and the decision he made in this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of this cabin. But still, he did not speak. And in that silence, filled with firelight shadows and the distant sound of approaching hooves, she realized that his choice was not only about her plea, it was about the future of both their worlds colliding in one fragile, uncertain night. The tension stretched until it was unbearable, until she could barely breathe. And just as she opened her mouth to speak again, the sound of a heavy knock thundered against the cabin door, shaking the frame and cutting the silence in two. The heavy knock on the cabin door echoed like thunder, rattling the walls and stirring the fire into a restless flicker. She froze where she stood, her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loud she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. The warrior's body stiffened, his broad shoulders squaring as he turned toward the sound. His hand instinctively moved toward the small blade strapped at his side, though his expression never changed. Calm, watchful, ready. The knock came again, this time followed by a voice, low, sharp, and commanding. She couldn't make out the words at first, muffled through the wood, but the tone was enough to tell her they weren't villagers. These were outsiders, riders who carried trouble like a storm on their backs. The sound of boots shifting on the porch confirmed it. They weren't passing by, they had stopped. Her chest tightened as she looked toward the warrior, silently begging for some sign of what to do. Should she speak? Should she stay silent? Every second stretched long and unbearable, but he gave no nod, no command, only raised one finger to his lips, signaling her to hold her breath and stay still. The men outside muttered to each other, their words clearer now. They were searching for someone. She strained to hear every syllable, fear crawling up her spine. They spoke of the girl, and her stomach dropped. They had followed her trail. They knew she had left the safety of the village. The warrior's eyes narrowed. He had heard it too. Without a sound, he moved across the cabin, his bare feet gliding over the wooden floor with the quiet grace of a hunter. He slipped into the shadows near the back wall, leaving her in the firelight, her figure still and trembling. She knew what he was doing, waiting, listening, ready to act if the door gave way. The men outside slammed their fists once more. "Open up!" one barked. We saw the smoke. "We know someone's in there." Her breath caught. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her chest, trying to silence the frantic beat of her heart. If they came inside, there would be no hiding what she had done, no denying where she had gone. They would see her standing in the home of the very man they called their enemy. The silence stretched dangerously. Then, as suddenly as the knocking had come, the footsteps retreated. She could hear them moving back toward their horses, their voices fading into the night. Relief washed over her in a wave so strong her knees nearly gave out. But the warrior remained still, his eyes fixed on the door until the last sound had disappeared into the distance. Only then did he return to the fire, his gaze fixed on her. "You led them here," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. He was right. She hadn't meant to, but desperation had blinded her to caution. She had thought only of reaching him, of asking for help before it was too late. She hadn't considered the risk of being followed. "I didn't know," she whispered, shame burning in her cheeks. "I didn't think they would." Her words trailed off. His expression remained unreadable, though the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. "Now they know," he said. "They know someone came to me. They'll tell your people. What do you think will happen then?" Her chest tightened. She could picture it already. The whispers in the village, the judgment in their eyes, the accusations. They would call her a traitor. They would say she had brought ruin upon them by stepping into this cabin, and maybe in their eyes she had. Still, she lifted her chin, her voice steadier this time. "They're coming for all of us, not just me. You heard them. They won't stop at my trail. They want the village, and they'll burn it if they can. You know this land better than anyone. You know what they'll do." His silence stretched, the fire crackling between them. He did not deny it, and that silence alone told her she was right. The cabin walls felt smaller with every passing minute, the weight of danger pressing in from all sides. But beneath the tension, another truth stirred, something deeper than fear. This was not only about the riders or the village. It was about the divide that had grown between her people and his, a divide now threatened by a force that neither side could face alone. She sank onto the bench by the fire, her hands gripping her skirt to stop them from shaking. Her mind spun with memories of her village, the faces of the children who played in the fields, the tired eyes of her mother, the strong but weary hands of the men who worked the land. She thought of how fragile it all was, how easily it could be swept away in a single night. The warrior remained standing, his shadow cast long against the stone wall. He was not a man easily swayed, she knew that. Yet she also saw in his eyes the weight of something unspoken. His people had lost much to outsiders already. Was he willing to risk more? Or was he bound by wounds too deep to forgive? A sharp crack outside startled them both. Branches breaking beneath boots, the sound of someone, or several someones, moving through the trees. She shot to her feet, but the warrior's hand was already raised, steady, commanding silence. He moved again toward the window, his body tense but controlled. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. His breath, even despite the growing threat. "They're circling back," he murmured. Fear clenched her chest, but beneath it burned something else, a spark of determination she hadn't known she carried. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Then we can't wait here. If they find us together, it will be too late." His eyes flicked toward her, assessing, measuring. She could see the conflict there, the war between his instinct to remain apart and the reality pressing down on them both. He had every reason to walk away, to let her face the danger alone. Yet she could not ignore the feeling that fate had drawn them into this night for a reason neither of them could yet see. The sounds outside grew louder, hooves pawing the ground, hushed voices arguing, the faint glint of lantern light weaving between the trees. The riders were not leaving, they were hunting. Her breath quickened as she turned back toward the fire, the warmth suddenly oppressive. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere safe to go, not alone, not without him. The warrior finally stepped away from the window, his face set in a mask of resolve. His silence had shifted now, not hesitation but decision. Still, he did not say what he had chosen, not yet. He only looked at her, his gaze steady, almost unyielding, as if testing whether she was truly ready for what was to come. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "What happens now?" The fire roared louder, the shadows deepening as the voices outside drew closer. He stood there, a figure of strength carved against the light, his presence steady even as the world seemed to press in from all sides. And though she waited desperately for his answer, For the words that would tell her if he was with her or against her, he spoke none. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, the cabin trembling with the weight of a choice that had yet to be spoken aloud. Outside, a lantern flame suddenly flared, casting light across the porch. Boots struck the wood once more. A voice called out, colder this time, sharper. "We know you're in there." Her heart lurched, her body frozen. The warrior's hand shifted toward his blade, his muscles coiling with readiness. The cabin door shuddered beneath the force of another pounding fist, and in that moment, balanced between silence and chaos, trust and betrayal, she realized that the night was only just beginning, and nothing that followed would leave either of their lives untouched. The door rattled under the force of the fists pounding against it, the wood creaking as though it might split at any moment. She stood frozen near the fire, her breath coming in shallow gasps, while the warrior remained still as stone, his hand poised near the blade strapped to his side. The light from the flames carved sharp shadows across his face, every line of it etched with focus, as though he was reading every sound outside like a hunter studying his prey. The voices grew sharper, impatient, their tones laced with the certainty of men who believed themselves in control. They weren't bluffing. They weren't guessing. They knew someone was inside and they wouldn't leave without finding out who. Lantern light spilled across the cracks in the wooden walls, long fingers of brightness stretching into the dark cabin. She pressed herself back against the stone hearth, her hands trembling as the weight of what she had done pressed heavily down on her. The warrior glanced at her once, his eyes steady, commanding her without words to remain quiet. She tried to obey, biting down on her lip to keep from gasping, but every slam against the door rattled her bones. Her thoughts spun wildly. If they forced their way in, if they saw her here with him, it would be the end of everything. The village would turn against her. The riders would mark her as their prey, and the man before her, the one she had begged for help, would be dragged deeper into danger because of her. Another heavy strike came against the wood, louder this time, making the hinges groan. She winced at the sound, every nerve in her body screaming. The warrior didn't move until the footsteps shifted again, pacing across the porch. Then he slid closer to the wall, his body moving with the fluid grace of a shadow, his bare skin glinting faintly in the firelight. He stopped just beside the door, waiting. "Break it!" one of the men outside snarled. Her pulse raced, the air in her lungs caught tight. She imagined the wood splintering, the door giving way and the cabin filling with men who would show no mercy. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the edge of her dress to keep from crying out. Then the first heavy blow struck, not fists this time, but boots and shoulders slamming against the door. Each hit echoed through the cabin like a drumbeat of war. The warrior's hand hovered near the handle of his blade, but he still hadn't moved, his breathing steady as though he had been born for this moment of stillness before chaos. She could see the tension coiling in his muscles, the silent promise that when he moved it would be swift, decisive. But for now he waited, listening. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air. She flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. The door shuddered again, the frame trembling under the force. She clutched her hands together so tightly her knuckles whitened, praying for some miracle that would keep the men outside from breaking through. But miracles were scarce on nights like this. The pounding stopped suddenly. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. For a moment she thought they had given up, but then came the scraping sound of metal against wood. They were prying it open, pulling at the latch with something sharp. The warrior's eyes flicked to the fire, then to her. He lifted a hand, signaling her to move back farther into the shadows. She obeyed, though every step felt heavy, her body unwilling to leave the faint comfort of the firelight. The latch strained, the wood cracking. Then came a voice, low and cruel. "Last chance. Open the door or we burn you out." Her breath hitched, terror clawing up her chest. She looked at the warrior, desperate for him to act, to speak, to give her any sign of what he would do. But his face remained unreadable, carved from silence, his eyes steady as the door shook again. She thought of her village then, of the children who would be sleeping unaware, of the families who would have no warning if these men chose to strike. She had come here for help, but now she wondered if she had doomed them all by being followed. The weight of that thought nearly buckled her knees. Outside, footsteps retreated from the porch, crunching over leaves and frost. She strained to hear, her ears catching the sound of muttered orders. Then the unmistakable scrape of flint. Her stomach dropped. They meant what they said. They would burn the cabin, flush them out like prey. The warrior's hand closed firmly around the handle of his blade at last. His jaw tightened, his body bracing as though preparing to step into the storm outside. For the first time since entering the cabin, she saw something flicker across his face. Not fear, but resolve. A decision had been made, though he had yet to speak it aloud. Her pulse thundered as smoke's faint scent drifted on the air, sharp and bitter. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. Every second stretched longer than the last, the crackle of fire outside building with the promise of destruction. The walls felt smaller, the air tighter. She looked at him again, her voice breaking into a whisper. "They'll kill us if we stay." His gaze cut to hers, steady, unwavering. He didn't answer, but the weight in his eyes said everything. He would not let them take her easily. He would not let the fire consume them without a fight. Still, the danger outside was more than just flames. She could hear the men, their voices rising as they laughed and cursed, certain of their victory. These weren't just hunters. They were predators, and they carried with them the same merciless hunger that had haunted this land for too long. Her mind spun through every path, every choice. If they fled now, they would be seen. If they stayed, they would be burned. If they fought, the sound of bloodshed would echo through the forest, carrying back to her village before dawn. And what then? What would her people say when they learned she had turned to him, that she had chosen to stand beside the one man they mistrusted most? The smoke thickened, curling into the cracks of the cabin walls. Her eyes stung, her throat tightening. She pressed her sleeve to her face, coughing quietly. The warrior reached for something near the hearth, a heavy fur, worn and rough. He thrust it toward her, his movements quick, silent, commanding her to shield herself. She clutched it close, though her hands trembled. Outside, the flames flared brighter, the light seeping through the shutters. Shadows twisted across the cabin walls, wild and unsteady. She felt her heart race faster with every flicker, each beat of it echoing like a drum inside her chest. The world outside was closing in, and yet inside the cabin, time seemed to stretch and break, holding her suspended on the edge of something she couldn't yet name. The warrior moved closer to the door now, his hand gripping his blade with quiet certainty. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his every step deliberate. The firelight painted him in gold and shadow, a figure both terrifying and unshakable. She felt her breath catch, her fear warring with something else, a raw, unspoken sense that she was standing at the edge of a choice that would change everything. The pounding came again, but this time, it was different. Not fists, not boots, but the sound of axes striking the doorframe. Wood splintered, shards falling to the floor. They were coming through. Her body froze, her hands clutched so tight to the fur that her knuckles burned. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand still. Yet all she could do was watch as the warrior braced himself, his shadow stretching long and fierce against the firelit wall. Another strike. The door cracked wider. Another, and the hinges groaned. She stepped back, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on him. She wanted to beg him again, to plead for some promise that they would make it out alive, but her voice refused to come. The night outside roared with fire and chaos, the men's laughter turning savage as the door gave way inch by inch. And in that unbearable moment, caught between the certainty of destruction and the fragile hope of survival, she knew the next heartbeat would decide everything. But the decision, the clash, the storm itself, still lingered just beyond reach, waiting to break. The door gave way with a crash, splintering inward as the men burst through, firelight and smoke spilling around them. For one suspended moment, everything slowed. The rush of boots on wood, the harsh gleam of steel, the shadows leaping like wild spirits on the walls. She clutched the fur to her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs, certain it would all end here. But the warrior moved first. He struck like lightning, blade flashing in the glow of the hearth. His movements were precise, controlled, born not of anger but of survival. The first man fell before he had time to raise his weapon. The second staggered, caught by the force of a blow that sent him crashing against the wall. Chaos filled the small cabin, but the warrior was calm inside it, every strike measured, every motion the work of someone who had lived his whole life with danger close at hand. She stumbled back into the shadows, her breath ragged as she watched. Fear clawed at her, but so did awe. This was not the savage her village had always warned of. This was a protector, a man who had chosen to stand between her and the storm. The fight raged in seconds that felt like hours. When the last man fled through the shattered doorway, his curses trailing into the night, silence returned, broken only by the crackling of firewood. Smoke still curled through the cabin, but the flames outside had not caught. The warrior stood breathing hard, his blade red at the edge, his chest rising and falling with quiet strength. She could barely move, her body trembling as though it too had fought the battle. When his eyes turned to her, she expected him to speak, to demand thanks or rebuke. But he only looked at her with the same unreadable depth as before. There was no triumph there, no boast, only a steady weight that reminded her how much this choice had cost him. Her voice came out soft, almost broken. "Why did you stay?" For a moment he said nothing. Then he lowered his blade, wiping it clean before setting it aside. "Because you asked," he replied simply. His words carried no pride, no bitterness, only truth. Tears stung her eyes as she sank onto the bench near the fire. Relief washed over her, but it was tangled with something more complicated. Gratitude, yes, but also guilt. He had risked everything for her, for a village that would never understand what he had done. The night pressed on outside, but the sounds of the riders were gone. Whether they had retreated for good or would return with more, she couldn't know. The cabin stood in uneasy silence, the flames in the hearth dimming as if exhausted by what they had witnessed. She lifted her gaze to the warrior again, words failing her, though her heart brimmed with things unsaid. He sat across from her at last, his movements deliberate, his strength still steady though his eyes showed weariness. He did not look like an enemy. He did not look like the stories. He looked like a man who carried the weight of two worlds, caught between the past and the uncertain future that waited just beyond the forest. The hours crept forward, each one heavier than the last. She found herself speaking quietly, haltingly, sharing the fears she had carried for so long. She spoke of the village, of how the people lived under the shadow of suspicion and fear, how their walls of mistrust blinded them to what was real. She confessed that even she had once believed those same stories, until desperation had forced her to see him for who he truly was. He listened, his silence not empty, but thoughtful. At times his eyes softened. At others they darkened with memories she knew she could never fully understand. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of history. "My people once lived in peace," he said. "The land was ours, the rivers, the mountains. Then others came, and we were pushed farther, forced to fight for what little remained. They call us the danger, but the danger was already here." His words pierced her, leaving her quiet, her heart aching with the truth she had always known, but never dared to face. The divide between their people was not born of chance. It was born of choices, of broken promises, of wounds that had never healed. The fire burned low as dawn crept nearer. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the walls, painting the cabin in soft silver. For the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to breathe more fully. The riders were gone. The danger, at least for now, had passed. Yet the greater battle still lingered, not outside, but in the silence between them. She knew she could not return to her village unchanged. If they learned where she had gone, if they knew who had saved her, their trust would shatter. But how could she keep silent after what she had seen? How could she let them believe lies when the truth burned so vividly before her eyes? The warrior rose as the first rays of light touched the cabin. He gathered what little he carried, his movements careful, steady. She watched him, dread pressing into her chest. Was he leaving? Was this where their paths ended? Her returning to her people, him vanishing once more into the wilderness, both carrying the weight of what had passed but unable to share it? Her voice trembled as she asked, "Will you come with me? To the village?" He paused, his hand resting on the frame of the shattered doorway. For a long moment he said nothing, only stared out into the trees where the smoke of the night still lingered faintly. Then he turned back to her, his expression calm, though his eyes held sadness. "They are not ready to see me as you do," he said. Her throat tightened, her heart aching at the truth in his words. But she also heard something else beneath them, hope, fragile but alive, that one day it might be different. She stepped closer, her hand hovering as though she wanted to reach for him but wasn't sure if she should. "Then let me be the one who carries the truth back to them. Let me tell them what you've done." He studied her for a long moment, then gave the smallest of nods. It was not agreement, not fully, but it was trust. Trust that she would carry his story with honesty, even if her people were unwilling to hear it. The morning light grew brighter, spilling across the forest. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on her, but also a strange peace. She had come seeking his help in desperation, believing she might leave with nothing. Instead, she carried with her not only survival but a new understanding, one that would forever change the way she saw her world. When she turned back to him, she found him already stepping into the trees, his tall figure blending with the shadows of the land he knew better than anyone. For a moment she thought to call out to beg him to stay, but she stopped herself. He belonged to the wilderness, to the wind and the earth, and she knew his path could not be bound by hers. She stood there until he vanished into the forest. The silence around her filled with the weight of everything they had endured. Then she turned toward the village, her steps heavy but steady. She knew what awaited her: questions, suspicion, perhaps even anger. But she also knew the truth, and it gave her strength. As she walked, she carried his words with her, each one a reminder of what she had seen and what she now must protect. The village would not change overnight. Trust would not come easily, but she had witnessed the courage of a man her people called an enemy, and she would not let that truth be lost to fear. The path ahead was uncertain, but the dawn was rising, and with it came the fragile promise of something new. She tightened her cloak around her shoulders, her heart steadying. The night had changed her forever, and though the road ahead would be long, she would carry the fire of that truth with her. Always.